Good evening and welcome to the 27 June 2024 edition of Continental Commandery's Maritime History Virtual Lecture Series. I'm Captain Fred Passman, Commander General-elect of the Naval Order of the United States, and I will be your host this evening. Since we started our program back in May of 2020, we've recorded more than 30 presentations, which you can find by visiting the Commandery's website and look at our past events page or our YouTube channel. And for more recent presentations, be sure to check out the live, and for older presentations, you'll see them in the archive. Before I introduce this evening's speaker, I'll just say a few words about the Naval Order of the United States. The Naval Order is our nation's oldest ancestral organization dedicated to maritime history. Our mission is to preserve, promote, and celebrate U.S. maritime history and promote camaraderie amongst our companions. Anyone who has served in any of the maritime services or who is a direct descendant of a maritime service veteran is invited to become a member of the Naval Order. For more information, visit the Naval Order's website. Today's presentation is recorded on YouTube and will be available for viewing shortly after the end of the presentation. So the same link you're using to watch us this evening, you'll be able to use to take a look at the recording at any time afterwards. We will wrap up before the presidential debate is scheduled to begin, so don't worry, there's plenty of time to shift from here to there. It's sure to be an interesting evening all around. Today's speaker is a fellow companion of the Naval Order. Captain Michael Lilly has had a distinguished career as Hawaii's Attorney General as a trial attorney. He's a founding director emeritus of the USS Missouri Memorial Association, which operates as the Missouri as a memorial tourist attraction in Pearl Harbor. He authorized Nimitz aides relating how his grandparents helped Nimitz cope with the stresses of command and to win the war in the Pacific. And that's what we're going to be hearing about this evening. Michael's a Vietnam War combat veteran, and his personal decorations include the Legion of Merit, Defense Meritorious Service Medal, and 2 Meritorious Service Medals. He retired as a surface warfare captain after 30 years of service of combined time, active duty, and in the selected reserve. Mike, welcome aboard this evening. It's good to have you back. For those that don't know, this is Captain Lilly's second time as one of our presenters, and it's a true pleasure to have you back. I'm looking forward to hearing your accounts of life and the great estate, and also had a question about the relationship between the title of your book and the title of the book recently published, Nimitz at War. Well, that's not a coincidence, is it?
No, and I'm going to mention at the end of my presentation, I'll give some insights.
Excellent. And so the other piece, not to give away any spoilers here, but Captain Lilly is the grandson of the Walkers, who feature quite largely in the book, and I'm sure we'll be hearing lots about them during this evening's presentation. So, Mike, I'm going to give you the deck and the con, go off screen, and let you take it from here.
Thank you, Fred. So, I'm going to be taking you on a journey to old Hawaii, to World War II in the Pacific, and it's going to have insights that are found nowhere else except in my book and this presentation. And essentially, Nimitz at Ease is a story about how Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz coped with the absolutely enormous stresses and demands of commanding the largest force in military history in war. Now, Nimitz assumed command on the end of December 1941, and he had a press release, a press conference actually, and he said the following using a Hawaiian word. "You asked several questions about the future, many of them no doubt pressing," said Nimitz. And you imagine at the time he's saying this, his fleet is underwater, and the press is saying, "You don't have a fleet. The Japanese can run all over the Pacific. What are you going to do?" And he says, "I'm a aina." Aina, which means someone who is a long-term resident of Hawaii. "I'm a aina myself, and I'd like to reply in a Hawaiian word. This word is omanawanui, meaning let time take care of the situation." Where did Nimitz come up with this Hawaiian word? My book answers it, and I'm going to explain at the end of this presentation where he got it. And the book also reveals the true and untold story about how my grandparents, Una and Sandy Walker, helped Nimitz cope and win the Pacific War. Now, I was in a unique situation because after my grandmother died, I discovered she'd kept a war diary. She also had hundreds of letters with Nimitz and some of his subordinate commanders and his aide. And Nimitz's grandson sent me the 4,000-page Graybook in digital format. And the Graybook was the daily command log. Every page of the Graybook has Nimitz's initials. It's what's going on during the war every day. I also had unpublished war photos that my grandparents had from Nimitz and memorabilia, but I was able to lay all this out on a desk, and I could tell what Nimitz was doing during the war, during the day, and what he was doing on the weekends or nights with my grandparents. Now, by way of background, Nimitz met my grandparents in 1920 when he came out to Hawaii as a 35-year-old lieutenant commander, and he was assigned to build the submarine base in Pearl Harbor, which was a big task because it mostly was cactus. But he did it. But he met them there. They lived nearby in Manoa Valley. And by 1941, my grandfather, Sandy Walker, was the president of American Factors, later AmFac. It was the largest company in Hawaii. It was a sugar factors industry, representing the sugar industry. My grandmother was the chair of the Red Cross Surgical Dressing Corps in Hawaii, and Nimitz rekindled their friendship. Now, the day before Pearl Harbor, this is my mother, Ginger. My mother was detailed by the Red Cross to pick up some Royal Australian and New Zealand flyers that were coming through for the day on their way to go to Europe to fight the Nazis. And so she picked them up and asked them, supposed to give them a tour, and she asked them, "Have you ever heard of Pearl Harbor?" And they said, "No." And my mother says, "Well, someday you might." And she took them to Aina Heights, which is way up above Pearl Harbor, where you could see the panorama of Pearl Harbor and all the ships in port the day before the attack. And the pilots got worried. They said, the Japanese could blockade the entrance to Pearl Harbor, and all the ships, the battleships and everything would be sitting ducks. Oh, they worried about it. Later on, she dropped them off at Aloha Tower, and they sailed on to Europe. And she was that night at a dinner party in Kahala, and a full moon up over the mountains. And she was playing bridge with Lieutenant Charlie Bryant. It was a PBY search and rescue pilot. And she was explaining to them what these pilots were saying, that they're sitting ducks. The Japanese could blockade Pearl Harbor, and they could all be bombed. And Charlie got really exasperated at my mother and finally said, Ginger, take it from me. The Japanese can't come within 1,000 miles of Hawaii without us knowing it. And he said, we're out there search and rescue every day. Well, they were searching in the southwest, thinking that if the Japanese came near the Hawaiian Islands, they'd come from the southwest. But as we all know, they were coming down from the northwest, and we weren't searching up there. Well, my mother had an uneasy sleep that night, worrying about what she'd heard. And the next morning, she woke up to Pearl Harbor. And I guess Charlie Bryant had to eat his words. Pearl Harbor was my grandparents' wedding anniversary. They had had a sit-down dinner planned for their wedding anniversary. The guests of honor were Admiral Kimmel, the head of the Navy, General Short, the head of the Army, both of whom soon got fired. They had florists and caterers and musicians and a sit-down dinner for 50. But my grandmother said, nobody called, nobody showed up, and nobody was surprised because everything was eclipsed by that day. Now, my grandmother immediately put on her uniform and went down to Honolulu Academy of Arts where they rolled bandages. And by the way, they had rolled enough bandages that they estimated that as of that time, they had enough bandages for the first 6 months of the war they expected that was coming. They used all those bandages up that day. She had 5,000 volunteers. 4,000 of them were Hawaiians and Portuguese and Caucasians, but 1,000 of them were Issei and Nisei Japanese. And not one of the Japanese showed up. And here's my grandmother on the phone, and she called Mrs. Asahina. Mrs. Asahina, you're not here. I need you down here at the Academy of Arts. Oh, Mrs. Walker, I'm so ashamed. I'm so ashamed. Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. I'm so ashamed. No, but I need you. You're my best worker. Please come. Please come. And Miss Asahina said, oh, Mrs. Walker, this is the most wonderful words I ever heard. And my grandmother had to call every one of her Japanese workers, the volunteers. All of them, all the Japanese were not showing up because they thought they would be shunned. But no, my grandmother knew they were loyal, and they were. They thought themselves as Americans, not as Japanese. And they all wound up down there, her best workers. Now, Nimitz's stresses were manifested in these ways. You have to realize that he was in charge of the largest military force in military history. His area was 62 million square miles, and he had 2 million service members under his hat. And he was responsible for all the successes and failures. And he would get these letters that his aide, Halimar, tried to keep from him. But one of them said, and this was not atypical, you killed my son on Taroa. And to his wife, Catherine, he wrote, I'm just as distressed as can be over the casualties, but I don't see how I could have reduced them. And he'd visit hospitals all over the Pacific and award Purple Hearts. And here he is awarding the Purple Heart to service members at Aia Hospital above Pearl Harbor. And on the right, you see the lady with the white handbag holding a box. That's my grandmother, Una Walker, handing out the Purple Hearts for Nimitz to award. And Nimitz's stress from command manifested itself in chronic insomnia. He was always awakening in the middle of the night with war news. He tossed and turned in the muggy Pearl Harbor. I lived in Makalapa in the summers, and it was hot. And he'd wind up studying the charts in his war room. He also had serious intestinal distress that my grandparents thought he should be hospitalized, but he never was, but it was serious. And it was all exacerbated by malaria that he contracted when he went to Guadalcanal. And actually, it was in 1942, late 1942, that he went to there. Now, this is my grandparents' beach house called Muliwai. Muliwai is Hawaiian for the water that goes, the stream water that goes over the sandbar into the sea. And they had about 1,000 feet of beachfront. Right in the center, there's a little cottage. That's where Nimitz spent all of his weekends. We'll be talking about that shortly. In the back, you see sugarcane. And those of you that know about Polynesian Culture Center, that's where the Polynesian Culture Center is. And right after the war, my grandfather went out to Muliwai and he got on his bathing suit and went out to take a swim in the ocean. And there were 9 rows of barbed wire. And he started threading his way through the barbed wire. And when he got down to the bottom, an army guy in green jumped up with a rifle and said, "Halt, you're off limits." And my grandfather said, "Well, this is my beach. I'm going swimming." No, I have my orders. It's off limits. You can't do that." And my grandfather said, "Well, we'll see about that." So Monday morning, Nimitz called his friend Nimitz. "Chester." "Yes, Sandy. Would you like to spend this next weekend with me at my beach house, Muliwai, on the north shore of Oahu?" And he'd heard about this hideaway. It's magnificent, about 6 acres and just pristine, beautiful, tropical beauty. Yes, he'd heard about it. "Yes, I'd like to." And so Saturday morning, Nimitz showed up, and my grandfather said, "Chester, would you like to take a swim?" And Nimitz was a lifelong athlete, and he loved to swim. And yes, of course. So they got into bathing suits, and they started to thread their way down through the barbed wire. And the army guy stood up with his rifle. "Halt, off limits." And he saw Nimitz. Now, Nimitz was recognizable with his white hair and blue eyes. Everybody knew him, and he was his ultimate boss. And Nimitz said, "This is Mr. Walker's beach, and he and his guests can swim here anytime they want." And they did for the rest of the war. And that's when Muliwai, what you're seeing here, began as the hideaway that Nimitz spent every weekend of the war thereafter at Muliwai. Now, this picture symbolizes my book. So there's Nimitz, and you always see Nimitz in a suit, or you see him in a uniform. But when do you see him barefoot and in a bathing suit? Well, here he is with my sisters, Sheila in the front and Miley in the back, crawling all over him. And that's Muliwai. And in the back is a gentleman. And that is Admiral Tom Hart. Tom Hart was the head of the Pacific Asiatic Fleet out in the Philippines at the time of Pearl Harbor. And he retired right after that, but he was brought back on active duty to investigate the attack on Pearl Harbor. They wanted to preserve the testimony of witnesses, and he had taken testimony that morning, and he adjourned at 12:30, and he showed up at 1:30 with Nimitz at Muliwai, and I know the date and the time because of my grandmother's diary. And here's another picture. That's Captain Preston Mercer, Nimitz's chief of staff, Admiral Hart with my sister Sheila, Nimitz with my sister Miley, and my mother Ginger, movie star gorgeous. And Nimitz was so taken with my sisters that he called them Major and Minor Gremlin. And here's the head of the Pacific Fleet and the Pacific Command on a weekend during the war, carrying one of my sisters, Miley, around on his back. And what did they do? They hiked in the hills. They played paddle tennis. They swam in the ocean. They played horseshoes. Nimitz was a great horseshoe player. They played poker and cribbage and archery. And in the evenings, they listened to the symphony on a Victrola, an early record player. But my grandmother always brought out her ukulele, and she'd sing wartime ditties like, "She's a knockout in the blackout, but would she be a knockout in the daylight? They couldn't take me how, no how." That was an Alex Anderson's war song. about a Japanese pilot that crashed on the small island of Niihau off of Kauai, and he tried to foment a riot among the Japanese residents. And Ben Kanahele, a sheep herder, though he had been shot 3 times by the pilot, killed the pilot with a rock. And this is the song about it. And that Ben Kanahele was given the Purple Heart for that, for being wounded, even though he was a civilian. He wasn't in the army. Princess Pupuli has plenty papaya. And we were never at Muliwai, that my grandmother, who has a wonderful pitch, better than me, she would sing, and we would all sing our family song, Muliwai. Aia ka muliwahi, ai ka home nani. Ooh, I get chills thinking about it. My grandfather made a Sandy's roll of double ringers, and it was etched in copper. And he was a very gentle man, humblest man I ever met. And he won the first double ringer, and I know he was mortified that he won that. And then his son Henry, that became very close to Nimitz, and you'll hear more later, he won the second one. I'm sure my grandfather was mortified by that. But right on the heels of the Battle of Lady Gulf, Nimitz finally won the third double ringer, etched into this plaque that my grandfather built. Nimitz's aide, Hal Lamar, said this about Muliwai. Nimitz enjoyed very much his time at Muliwai. The walkers let him get in an aloha shirt and a pair of shorts and talk no business at all. It was all very relaxing for him. We talk about orchids. We talk about mundane things. The war never came into the picture. And this is Nimitz's cottage, where he could sleep with no distractions from the war. That's it today. And that's as it looked when Nimitz spent his weekends at Muliwai. It's a 2-bedroom cottage. Now, they alternated dinners between my grandparents' estate in Nu'uanu Valley, and this is their estate. It was a world-famous orchid garden. And interesting thing about my grandparents, they employed 2 Japanese nationals, Japanese nationals, all through the war. One was Suitaro Goto. He was a yard man, and he was detailed on the day of Pearl Harbor to go down to the lower gate and to greet the invading Japanese army. They had alerts broadcast that there were paratroopers landing and the Japanese were landing troops on the shore. They were being invaded, and they expected the Japanese army to march up Nu'uanu Valley. So Suitaro Goto was to be stationed at the lower gate, and when they got there, the Japanese army got there, he would tell them in their language that the walkers were good people. And then there was Hara, their cook, all through the war. Hara was a Japanese national who cooked maybe over 100 meals for Nimitz and the entire Pacific High Command. He could have poisoned the entire Pacific High Command anytime during the war, but he was loyal to my grandparents, and he was a good man, even though he was obviously an alien, but it's sort of an irony. Now, here's a garden party in my grandparents' garden that Hara cooked for all of these dignitaries. It's a who's who of war. So if you start at the left, the first man is Chester Nimitz. To the right of him is a great big bear of a man, my grandfather. And then 3 people over is a skinny guy, tall, skinny guy with a bald head. That's Sock for Socrates, because he's brainy, smart. Socrates McMorris, Sock McMorris, who was Nimitz's chief deputy. To the right of Sock is a man in a suit, and that is Frank Knox, the Secretary of the Navy. To the right of the Secretary of the Navy is Admiral Spruance, the hero of Midway and many of the battles of World War II, including the Marianas Turkey Shoot. And then over to the far right is Halimar, Nimitz's aide. And these three, Nimitz, my grandfather, and Spruance, became very close friends. And I would hear stories from my grandfather about his relationship with these two, and they were giants. And then Nimitz lived at 37 Makalapa, and every commander of the Pacific Fleet to this day, since Nimitz, has lived there. And he wrote on there, "My room," with an arrow. So that was where he lived, was on the bottom floor. And in order for my grandparents to go from their house in Nu'uanu to Makalapa every time, and they were there often, almost weekly, they had to get a one-day temporary night pass signed by the chief of police, here the assistant chief of police, in order to go there and come back. And when they went to dinner at Makalapa, the staff would paint these unique, very clever name tags. So here's one for my grandmother. And remember, she's the head of the surgical dressing corps. So they wrote on, they painted up here a mummy wrapped up in Red Cross surgical bandages for the head of the surgical dressing corps. Here's one with a little grass shack and an outrigger canoe. A sailor dancing the hula with a coconut tree in the background. That's a volcano, but it's a kind of like Fuji. It's one of these volcanoes in Hawaii are shield. They're not like that, but very clever. And then once a week, Nimitz would show up at my grandparents and ask if they wanted to go for a swim in Kailua Beach on the other side of the mountains. And he never said when he was coming and never told anybody because for security reasons. He would just show up and they would go and have a 5-mile walk and swim down Kailua Beach and back. And sometimes it'd be my sisters with him. And here's my sisters again, Miley and Sheila. But notice his left hand. Look at his left hand. He's missing his ring finger. And that's from an accident with a diesel machine 20 years or so earlier. And my sisters used to say he would pretend to rip off his finger to their, kind of gleeful or, anyway, they see this finger would disappear. And Nimitz's grandsons told me that he used to play that game with them as well. He had a lot of humor and he would play tricks and things like that. And then he would send pictures back to my grandparents. And here's one at Kwajalein. And Kwajalein had been decimated by Spruance. And here's Nimitz and Spruance, and they signed each of their bodies, Chester Nimitz, Admiral Spruance. And Nimitz writes Kwajalein, February 44, 2 full admirals full of conversations. And look at Kwajalein. It was just absolutely decimated, the trees and everything shredded. And then in March of 44, the Joint Chiefs of Staff detailed Nimitz to go to Brisbane to see MacArthur. And it took 2 days to get there, island hopping. And it was grueling, and he was tired, and he wound up meeting MacArthur. And MacArthur was brilliant, but he had a big ego, big as the moon, and a big voice. And Nimitz said, "I've been detailed to let you know that the Joint Chiefs of Staff wanted to bypass the Philippines." And MacArthur blew up. He was furious. He says, "I promised to return. I'm going to return." And Nimitz was a gentleman. He never raised his voice, and taken back by this blow up by this guy with a great baritone voice. And he flew back 2 more days, grueling trip back to Pearl Harbor. And in a very poignant scene, the minute he landed in Pearl Harbor, he called my grandparents up and he said, "Sandy and Una, can I come over for dinner?" I'm not going to bring Halamar. I'm coming by myself. Can I just come over and spend some time with you?" And they detailed Hara to go to his quarters, and my grandfather cooked the meal, which they ate out on the back lanai to the trade winds and the smell of pikaki, orchids, and plumeria. And they played cribbage and they smoked. And Nimitz was able to let down his hair and just relax after that trip. And to me, it's the most poignant of their experiences together. He had a wry sense of humor, as I said. In Easter 1943, Nimitz invited all the children of his local Hawaii business friends to an Easter egg hunt at 37 Makalapa. And my cousin, Johnny Walker's maybe 5 or 6, and he was among them. And they were searching for Easter eggs, but he had a call to nature. And so he went into 37 Makalapa to find the water closet, which he did. And he was amazed to find the following. There were 3 rolls of toilet paper, and on each sheet of each roll, there was a picture. The first roll, all the pictures were of Emperor Hirohito. On the second roll, every sheet had a picture of Mussolini. And on the third roll, every sheet had a picture of Hitler. This is the kind of humor Nimitz had. I've never seen this anywhere. Johnny kept some, but lost them over the years. I wish he kept it. I could have used it in my book. Then October 6, 1944, Nimitz called a press conference. All the press came in, the AP, and he said, "On this day, the Japanese fleet was utterly destroyed off the island of Kyushu." Oh, they knew that Halsey was out there rampaging in the west. Halsey must have sunk this fleet off the Kyushu, absolutely wiped out the fleet. And they were broadcasting, the AP was broadcasting it as he spoke across the country, went all the way to London. The presses would stop, and they had to stop the front page, and they put up a new front page that the Japanese fleet has been annihilated off Kyushu this day. And it wasn't until the very end, he said, it was this day, October 6, 1598. It was the Korean fleet had sunk the Japanese fleet off of Kyushu. That's the kind of humor that Nimitz he'd pull everybody's legs. He was a wonderful guy. This is the picture of what Nimitz would awake to every morning at Muliwai. This is what it looks like today. And to Catherine, he wrote that he had spent the last night of 1944 at Muliwai, and he awakened to the sun, refreshed and relaxed. And in January, he moved 4,000 miles to the west to Guam. And Guam was just as decimated by bombs as that picture you saw of Kwajalein. And he asked the Walkers to load the regular flag plane that came weekly with anything that could grow. Seedlings, orchids and coconut husks, monkey pod seeds, lychee seeds, ginger root, papaya, citrus, anything. And they did. They just filled it with flowering and fruiting things. And then Nimitz, among the things he wrote, he said, quote, "We took a walk with our pockets filled with monkey pod seeds and a few flowering tree seeds, which we carefully planted at intervals. And in later years, when you two visit Guam and see all of the fruit and the flowering trees and the nice plants, you can take great satisfaction in your share in this program." Then in March, Nimitz brought my grandfather the 4,000 miles from Hawaii to Pearl Harbor for a week. And here they are on the cabin cruiser Catherine, for Nimitz's wife. And there's my grandfather fishing, and I can tell you he's tired. I can see it in his eyes. And there's Nimitz on the bottom, and then Hal Lamar between them. Now, my uncle, Henry Walker, as I said, was close to Nimitz, and he had bad eyes, but Nimitz not only got him into the Navy, but got him assigned to the battleship Missouri. So he was an officer, a communication officer on Missouri on the day of the surrender. And on the day of surrender, there was a broadcast over the 1MC, the loudspeaker, Lieutenant J.G. Walker to the wardroom. Your presence is requested at the wardroom. So he went down there, figured that Nimitz was waiting for him, wanted to see him. And there's nobody there. And he's looking around. The wardroom is empty. Everybody's out waiting for the surrender. But out of one hatch comes 5-star General MacArthur. And the other hatch comes 5-star Admiral Nimitz and 5-star Admiral Bill Halsey. And they come together, the three of them. And my uncle said, I'm the only one in here. I'm watching history. Boy, this is something. And MacArthur, with his baritone voice, went up to Chester and he grabbed Chester's hand and he said, Chester. And then he grabbed Bill Halsey's hand and put it over Chester. Bill, this is the day toward which we have strived for so long. Oh, my uncle says, my God, I've never seen it. This is history. I'm here. I'm the only one here. And they broke to sign the surrender. And as they were leaving, Nimitz saw my uncle and he says, oh, Henry, I had dinner with your parents recently. And when you come through Guam, you'll have dinner with me. But where are your collar bars? We're going to wear wash khakis for the surrender, but we're also going to wear the insignia of our rank. And my uncle looked down and he said, oh my God, I didn't put down my Lieutenant JG bars. Lieutenant JG just got dressed down by a 5-star admiral, he said. And then Nimitz gave him his wintry smile and went off to the surrender. And then here's the famous picture of Nimitz. And he inscribed this to Sandy and Una, my grandparents, with best wishes and appreciation for their contribution to the war effort, which made possible this picture. Now, in October 27, 1945 is the Navy Day, but also it was an important day for Nimitz because he was going to be invested as a High Chief of Hawaii, an honorary High Chief, by the daughters and sons of Hawaiian warriors. But he wanted to say whatever he was going to say in Hawaiian. So he went to my grandparents, and he knew that my grandfather, Sandy, was born and raised in Hawaii under the monarchy. He grew up speaking fluent Hawaiian. And he told them what he wanted to say. And they translated it and typed it onto a card, which I have. And this is the card. And Nimitz was standing on the Iolani Palace grounds to a throng of 10,000 people out on the grounds. And he raised this card and he said, Eina ho'olo'a mai kai o Hawaii nei, ke he hawi aku neau, I ku'u ho'o mai kai pia, a me ku'u aloha nui loa, ia o ko pau, aloha, aloha kako. To my good friends of dear Hawaii, I give my overflowing thanks and my very fullest aloha, aloha for us all. They corresponded for the next 20 years. And this was the first page of the last letter they received, 11 months before he passed. And Nimitz said, I have now sworn off birthdays, interviews, and anything that attracts mail. And then he passed away on February 20, 1966. He was just 5 days older than my grandfather, who passed 3 years later. Ho'omanawanui, I told you about Ho'omanawanui. When I was troubled, my grandparents and parents, as I grew up, soothed me with the word Ho'omanawanui. It sounds like long ocean swells, like whales. It means all things will work out in time. And now we know where Nimitz got that word. He learned it from my grandparents, my grandfather. And it did. As Nimitz's grandsons wrote in the foreword to the Nimitz at Ease, the Walkers provided Nimitz with a refuge from the stresses of high command, where he could swim, walk, dine, and play poker, his own private USO. And this is the last letter, picture that he inscribed to my grandparents. Now, mentioned Nimitz at War earlier, and Craig Simons honored me by allowing me to read the draft and make suggestions. And I view it as a companion book. And Craig not only wrote the Naval War College review of my book, but he also wrote me, now we'll have both Nimitz at Ease and Nimitz at War. Nimitz at Ease is Nimitz the man with the war in the background, and Nimitz at War is Nimitz the warrior with the man in the background. And I thank you for your attention.
That was excellent. Thank you so much. You know, we think of these heroes as something other than human, as, you know, titans. And it's so refreshing to have a book like the one you've written, where we talk about a genuine man. You know, your sisters knew him during the war period. Did you get a chance to know him at all as you were growing up?
I met him, but I was too young to remember.
Okay. Because did he ever come back to Hawaii after he moved to California?
Never did. Never came back. It was kind of sad. My grandmother built the Nimitz Cottage, another cottage, in 1946 on the property there. And every commander-in-chief of the Pacific Fleet and Pacific Command stayed there thereafter. But because Nimitz never returned, she turned it into the admiral's cottage.
Right. Okay. So this beautiful beachfront property, you knew when you were young, and you say now it has been converted. I guess I first saw it as the Polynesian Cultural Center when
that's in the back. That's across the road.
That's across the road. So it's not that property, but it's
no. We split it up, and my aunt got one section, my uncle got another, and we got the third.
Okay.
And my family still has a third of Muliwai. And the original property is still there. The original house is still there.
Do you get over there at all, or?
I do, at least 2 or 3 times a year.
Terrific. You know, one of the things we were discussing just earlier this week is, you know, why don't we have a Hawaii commandery? And I explained to the other folks in the conversation, it seems like a great idea, but there's a bit of ocean separating each of the islands. I think we've got 1 or 2 companions on each of several islands.
Yeah.
And to get from one island to another is comparable to getting from like Philadelphia to Chicago.
Exactly.
It's not a walk around the corner. It's not a short drive.
No, it's a plane ride.
It's a plane ride, or I guess they have high-speed ferries. It's all done by plane.
All by plane.
All by plane.
Unfortunately.
Excellent. Amazingly, we don't have third-party questions, which is, you know, I guess it reflects the personal nature of your presentation. Now, you know, you're connected to this history, and do your sisters ever talk about their time during the war?
Yeah, they both did. And when I was writing my book, I got a lot of details that they knew because they were older than me. My older sister told me that when Nimitz first came out there that first time, he looked around for where the phone was so he could get in touch with Pearl Harbor. And my grandparents sort of wanted that to be a hideaway, and they hadn't installed a phone. But the next week when he came out, they had one installed. And they had to move heaven and earth to get a phone out there. Then that was out in the country. I
Right. I
don't know.
think Craig Simmons actually talks about getting that phone installed. I'm getting for whoever cannot hear the sound. Brother Dave, he's one of my old shipmates, and he said he's not hearing sound. Check the bottom right corner of your screen. Make sure your sound is on your computer because others are hearing it.
I'm
Um,
hearing. I'm not muted.
no, I hear you fine. Um, I we have a post from Raja Sivadas. I'm sorry if I messed up your name, but he was part of the Hawaii Commanders in the 80s and 90s. But like you said, the meetings in Oahu were sparse, maybe 2 to 5 of you. Okay, I
Yeah.
understand. Oh, you were part of the Hawaii Commandery. And
Oh,
Raja, I
interesting.
don't know whether you joined the San Francisco Commandery or the Continental. Either way, it's great that you're still involved. And someday we'll be able to think creatively, even if you folks start having virtual gatherings
Yeah.
like we do here in Continental, this being a virtual Continental gathering, uh, because I think we've got about 11 companions spread around the islands, probably amongst 2 or 3 islands. I think there may be one or two on Kauai, Maui, Big Island, and Oahu.
Yeah. I'd be interested to know who they are. See if I know them.
I will. Oh, okay. He's now back in San Francisco, so because he now lives in California. But I will send you. We're due for a new updated roster, and I will send you all the folks who are companions in the Hawaii area. And maybe we come up with a way, if even if it's just virtual meetings or once a year convening and over 4 year cycles, uh,
Can
selecting venues on different islands.
I get back to your question about what my sister said?
Yeah, please.
My younger sister, she's old. She was older. Also, Sheila. She used to go be in the back seat with Nimitz, and they'd go around the curvy poly highway, and she always got car sick. And she has all these memories of being held outside the car by Admiral Nimitz while she was barfing, and it just struck her. She got a 5-star admiral holding her while she's throwing up all the time. And then my sister Miley was to this day is mortified. Nimitz had one of the first mobile phones. I think it was a Motorola. I'm not sure, but he had a mobile phone installed in his car, and it had a long handset bake light, that heavy plastic bake
Right.
light handle, and Hal Lamar became like a surrogate uncle, but he was teasing them all the time, and she was swinging this bake light phone handle around and hit him in the teeth and knocked his tooth out.
Oh, geez.
And he had to have the tooth fixed. But
Admiral Lamar's tooth?
Hal Lamar, to
Yeah,
this day, she cringes when she thinks about doing that. She didn't mean to.
of course not. But, people do things when they're children. That's childhood, isn't it?
Yeah.
Amazing stuff. Well, we're coming to the top of the hour, and I will do another round. Anybody else want to post a question? Dave, if you have a question, type it in, and I'll be glad to share it with Mike. Dave is a past commander of the Texas Commandery, and he and I were shipmates back in the early 80s. Let's see. Seeing none, again, I'll take this opportunity to thank you for really fascinating. We hear about battles, we hear about major world events. We hear about histories of larger than life personalities, which Nimitz definitely was, but we don't hear about that other side. And
Yeah.
I think it's a tremendous contribution to the history literature, that you know, you share a side of Nimitz that the most folks wouldn't even think about. Okay, Dave writes, Malo Nui for a wonderful presentation and book. He's read the book, and he's also I'll let you pronounce it as well, a Kikaoka
Keiki
Kikiokana as
born
well.
of the earth, the child born of the earth. Keiki Okaina.
Okay, I didn't know Dave was had spent that much time out in Hawaii. There you go.
That's a real kamaina. Is a person born here.
Okay.
Keiki Okaina.
Okay. I didn't realize. Dave, we'll email exchange offline. Dave and I probably exchange emails at least once every couple of weeks. So
Good.
I've got an action item. So before we go, I just want to again, besides thanking you, let everybody know that our next program will be on 25 July, where Master Chief Petty Officer Dave Mattingly, who anybody who's come to a national congress has met, and Dave is going to talk about the Coast Guards and Marines operating together during World War II in the Pacific Theater. So that we go back next month to talking about battles, and looking forward to that. Dave's a great speaker, and hope you all be able to join us for that. And with that, one more. Born and raised in Hawaii, as was his mother, so he's a second generation Hawaiian. I see you've already responded to him. Okay.
I'm fifth generation. My great-great-grandmother was born in Lahaina in 1847.
Wow. Was that amongst the early missionaries coming to Hawaii?
No, her father was a merchant and
sugar plantations or pineapple plantations?
My grandfather was in sugar, but my great-great-grandparents were in mercantile.
Mercantile, okay.
They were proud they weren't missionary.
I'll bet. I recall reading the Michener book, and he wasn't so fond of their impact on the Hawaiian culture.
There's a lot of truth in that book.
I'll bet, yeah, he seems to have gotten his histories, quite solidly.
Many of the characters in the book are amalgamation of different people.
Right.
And one of them was my grandfather. And so my grandfather wasn't very happy with the way it was portrayed.
I'm okay. He thought it was too harsh or too
salacious.
Okay.
And he wasn't that way at all. He was very humble, and I mean, he's a straight shooter. And anyway, he was not happy with how but it wasn't just, it was a character that had a whole bunch of different real people, and he was one of the real people that guy was made up of.
Okay. So again, it was written as historical fiction with, I think, the balance leaning towards the fiction for dramatic purposes, but enough of the history to give those of us, it was my first education on early Hawaii. We learned about
it's a great history.
Exactly. Well, I'm glad to hear that from you. With that, I want to wish everybody a great evening or rest of the afternoon, and look forward to seeing everybody back on the 25th of July. Remember, the recording of this presentation will be available momentarily. Everybody, be well.
Thank you, Fred.